When I first set foot in Vietnam, I genuinely expected to be welcomed with open arms by the people. I had this image in my head, vivid as the black and white newsreels from Walter Cronkite's 20th century show of American troops rolling through villages in France, showered with wine and flowers and kisses. That was my mental blueprint for a liberator's reception. A guy from the battalion I was assigned to picked me up in a Jeep at Da Nang. We had to drive 20 miles to where my battalion was located, and as we drove, I was genuinely disappointed. There weren't people standing along the road waving to me, offering me flowers and things. I really expected to be greeted with open arms as a liberator. Instead, it was as if I was invisible, as though I didn't exist. That was a little perplexing. Moreover, it was just different. The air hung thick and heavy, not just with humidity, but with 1,000 unfamiliar smells. Fish sauce, burning charcoal, damp earth, and something else. Something subtly acrid that clung to everything. They looked funny, and they acted funny. Just riding along in that Jeep on my first day there, I saw them living in little straw huts with animals in their backyards. They weren't like us. And the smell, they smelled bad. The whole country smelled bad. You could smell it, and it hurt the nose. That was disturbing. My initial idealism, born from those heroic newsreels, was already beginning to fray at the edges. The reality was a silent, almost hostile indifference, coupled with a sensory assault that hinted at a world far removed from anything I'd ever known. At one point, we passed a small group of children playing near a dusty path. One boy, no older than 5, stood frozen, clutching a worn wooden bird. I instinctively reached into my pocket for a piece of candy, a small, innocent gesture. But his mother, her face a mask of fear, quickly pulled him behind her, her eyes wide, then narrowed at me. It was a small gesture, met with a stark rejection, reinforcing the growing chasm between my expectations and the bewildering reality. The wooden bird, clutched tightly in the child's hand, became a fleeting, unsettling image, a symbol of something I couldn't quite grasp. It was only my 3rd day there. The corporal who had picked me up in the Jeep, Jimmy, was the guy I was ultimately going to replace. We were both in the battalion intelligence section. We were sent down to the tractor park, the amphibious tractor Amtrak park, to meet a bunch of detainees. It was our responsibility to handle prisoners, and detainees were a classification of civilians. They were not combatants. They could be detained for questioning. That's why they were called detainees. Jimmy and I went down to the tractor park, and 2 Amtraks came in. They had a whole bunch of Vietnamese people up on top, high, flat-topped vehicles, about 8 or 9 feet tall. As the tracks wheeled into the park, the Marines up on top immediately began hurling these people off. They were bound hand and foot, so they had no way of breaking their falls. And they were old men, women, children, no young men. I couldn't believe these guys were treating these people this way. A wave of nausea hit me. The metallic tang of fear filled my mouth. I turned to Jimmy, grabbed him by the arm, and said, What are these guys doing? We're supposed to be helping these people." My voice was tight, a desperate plea against the unfolding brutality. Jimmy turned to me. He looked at my hands on his arm, and I sort of took them off. His gaze was cold, devoid of the camaraderie I had expected. He said, "Erhard, you better keep your mouth shut until you know what's going on around here." I think it was at that point that I realized things were not quite what I was expecting. That moment was a punch to the gut, a brutal awakening. The mirror of my naive expectations shattered, revealing a grim, distorted reality. For weeks afterward, the image of a small, elderly woman, her hands bound, tumbling from the Amtrak, replayed in my mind. It was a silent film of horror, a constant reminder that I had stepped into a world where the lines between right and wrong were blurred beyond recognition. I found myself obsessively drawing the wooden bird I'd seen, sketching it on scraps of paper. A futile attempt to hold on to some semblance of innocence in this new, brutal landscape. It went downhill from there. I can't even begin to explain all the things that went into it in the time we have, but I began to understand. It became obvious that the enemy was the very people in these villages around us. We were in a very heavily populated area at that time. They were the enemy, or at least the enemy was out there somewhere, and we couldn't tell one from another. Day after day, our patrols went out, and we ran into snipers and mines, and snipers and mines, and snipers and mines. I saw 4 armed enemy soldiers in the first 8 months I was in Vietnam, and yet our battalion, during that same period, sustained 75 mining and sniping incidents per month. Over half of them resulted in casualties. This was for a unit of about 1,000 men, but there was no one to fight back at. You begin to think these people are the enemy. They're all the enemy. And then you go through villages, and you get sniped at, and so you call an airstrike in on the village, and the whole village goes up. Or you go through a place, and you search it, and you burn houses and blow them up. I remember one particular hut, a small, meticulously maintained structure with a vibrant potted orchid by the door. We were ordered to clear and burn it. As the flames consumed the straw, I saw a small hand-carved wooden bird, perhaps a child's toy, fall from the collapsing roof. It was a fleeting image, but it seared itself into my memory, a tiny, innocent casualty of our search and destroy. One sweltering afternoon, our patrol entered a village that felt eerily quiet, too quiet. We moved through the deserted huts, weapons raised. In the center of the village, an old man sat on a low stool, meticulously carving a piece of wood. He didn't look up as we approached, his weathered hands working with a serene focus. Sergeant Miller shouted at him, but he didn't respond. As we prepared to move on, I noticed the object he was carving, another small wooden bird identical to the one the child had clutched. It was a moment of profound, unsettling stillness amidst the chaos. He looked up then, his eyes ancient and weary, meeting mine for a fleeting second before we were ordered to move on. That silent gaze, devoid of anger but full of a deep, resigned sorrow, spoke volumes. It was a horrifying realization. We were fueling the very fire we were sent to extinguish. None of that distilled itself into the clear kind of expression that I'm presenting now. What I began to understand within days, and which became patently clear within months, was that what was going on here was not what I had been told. What was going on here was nuts, and I wanted to get out. I knew if I was still alive on March 5th, 1968, they'd stick me on an airplane in Da Nang. We used to call it the Freedom Bird, and I could fly away and forget the whole thing. It turned out not to be quite so easy to forget it, but that was the notion. And certainly, for my last 8 or 9 months in Vietnam, I ceased to think. I quite literally ceased to think about why I was there or what I was doing. The sole purpose for my being in Vietnam at that point was to stay alive until I could get out. The reason for that is that the kinds of questions that began to present themselves were just, the questions themselves were ugly, and I didn't want to know the answers. It's like banging on a door. You knock on a door, and the door opens slightly, and behind that door, it's dark. And there are loud noises coming, like there are wild animals in there or something, and you peer into the darkness, and you can't see what's there, but you can hear all this ugly stuff. Do you want to step into that room? No way. You just sort of back out quietly, pull the door shut behind you, and walk away from it. That's what was going on. The questions themselves were too ugly to even ask, let alone if I had to deal with the answers. Part of what was going on, as I said, I could not have made sense of what I was seeing and doing in Vietnam because I did not have a full deck of cards. I needed to have an understanding of the political and historical realities that brought us to Vietnam before I could make sense of what I was seeing. I began to acquire the other cards in the deck during the 3 years or so after I got back from Vietnam. But while I was there, nothing made sense because I kept trying to play this game with 27 cards instead of 52 cards. And it kept not coming out right, and I didn't know why. All I knew was that it was nuts. And it became clear within 3 or 4 months that my reasons for being in Vietnam were not clear. This notion of defending the people against these invaders from North Vietnam, the people hated me. The Vietnamese people hated me. And that was perfectly clear. I mean, the people didn't say good morning to you. People hated me. I know that some other people's experience was different, but in my own experience, the Vietnamese people hated me, and I gave them every reason to hate me. I beat them. I sometimes killed them. I destroyed their houses. I destroyed their crops. I destroyed their fields. I destroyed their culture. Why in the hell should those people like me? And I could see that I was doing that. And I could see that nothing we were doing was having any impact on the war itself. The funny thing about Vietnam is that I was getting Time magazine every week. It came in the mail. I could read about my war even as I sat in the middle of it. And I would read about what Lyndon Johnson would say and what McNamara would say and what Rusk would say. And I could look around and see that, aha, I don't know what war they're talking about, but that's not what's going on here. I remember one article vividly describing a strategic hamlet as a beacon of democracy, while I was literally looking at the barbed wire and watchtowers of that very hamlet, knowing the villagers were essentially prisoners. The disconnect was jarring, a constant reminder that the narrative back home was a carefully constructed lie. We actually had an incident where one of our line companies stumbled upon a fairly large cache of Viet Cong weapons and ammunition. And I read in the Stars and Stripes, the daily newspaper that we received, that this little action actually made it into the papers. And we read that we had set the Viet Cong effort back by at least 4 months in our area. Within a week of that article appearing in the paper, within 10 days of the incident itself, the bridge 150 meters in front of our battalion compound was dropped by Viet Cong sappers. An Amtrak coming in from the Horseshoe area from one of the line companies hit a 50-pound box mine. Several men were killed. A bunch more were wounded. A patrol out of Phuc Track Grid was ambushed. Several people were killed. Several people were wounded. Nobody told the Viet Cong that they'd been set back for 4 months, and yet this is what you're reading in the newspapers. This is what you're being told back in the United States. I could see that the war went on day after day after day, interminably, at the same pace, no matter what we did. The wooden bird, which I had started to sketch in my small notebook, became a constant silent question mark. Each time I drew it, the old man's eyes would appear in my mind, and I'd wonder what he truly saw in us. When I left Vietnam, I was, at the time, in the midst of the battle for Hue City during February '68. I had been up in the city for 3 weeks, and I knew that my day was coming, but I wasn't sure when. At that point, we weren't thinking about things like that. We were in the middle of a low-key firefight. We were exchanging fire with some guys across the street from us along the northeast section of Hue City. What was left of my unit, the Scouts, about 6 of us. And a Jeep comes hauling up the street along the river and whips into this little compound where we were and says, "Earhart, the orders are in. Let's go." It was a lieutenant, my boss. I didn't exactly stand up, but I immediately began to strip off my gear and distributed it to the other guys who were there and said, "So long, see you back in the world." I got on the Jeep. The last thing I saw of those guys, they were laying down cover and fire for us. We burned our way back down the street. There was a chopper sitting on the LZ. I got on the bird. I was up 3,000 feet above Hue City. 10 minutes after, I knew I was on my way out. The ground, a patchwork of craters and rubble, shrank beneath me, but the images of what I'd seen refused to shrink with it. I went through some processing. They yanked me out early because one of my older brothers by this time had arrived in Vietnam, and they arranged for me to spend a couple of days with him. And I got back. When I got back in early March, I came in at night, went through more processing at a place called Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay, and then I was free to go. I still had time in the Marines. I had a month's leave, basically. Before I had to report to another duty station in North Carolina, I got a taxi, and there I was, my first view of the United States. I could hardly wait, and it was absolute impenetrable fog. We came across the Oakland Bay Bridge. Couldn't see 10 feet, couldn't see anything. Got to the airport. The familiar sounds of civilian life, car horns, distant chatter, the hum of fluorescent lights were almost overwhelming after the constant thrum of the jungle and the sharp crack of gunfire. My senses, dulled by months of hypervigilance, felt assaulted by the mundane. The smells of home, once longed for, now felt alien, too clean, too artificial, lacking the raw, earthy scent of survival. Part of what affected my coming back was that I was happy to be alive. I was excited, but at the same time, I was very ambivalent. I was afraid, partly because I had a girlfriend when I went over there, and in September, 8 months after I was there, I got a Dear John letter from her. I kept hoping that I'd be able to fix this up once I got back. And I did not know what kind, and that woman, that girl, had become the focus of my life while I was in Vietnam. She had ceased to be a real person. She'd become this icon. And then, of course, she had sort of, she'd take a hike. But you can't just let go of a vision like that, of the thing that has kept you going. So I was scared about all that. I didn't know what I was going to find when I got back. Finally, I got back to the East Coast. But the journey home was just the beginning of another unseen war. The quiet was the hardest part. The absence of constant noise, the lack of immediate threat, left a gaping void. The questions I had refused to ask in Vietnam, those ugly truths I had backed away from, would eventually demand their answers in the echoing silence of my own mind. And the illusion of the liberator shattered on a dusty road in Da Nang, would give way to the long, quiet battle of understanding what had truly happened, a battle that would be fought in the quiet of my own mind, far from any jungle. The wooden bird, now a phantom in my memory, would be the only witness to this